On-campus interviews, information for disabled law students. Learn about preparing for spring interviews from a disability-centered perspective.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Marissa Ditkowski. I'm the Associate Director for Job Accommodations at Endulsa. My day job, I'm an attorney at SEDEC DC, and I graduated from American in 2019, so I'm a recent graduate. I do want to make sure that y'all know that we do have captioning for those who need it. If you click on the closed captioning in the corner on the bottom, and you just click on the show subtitle, just make sure that you do that so that you can get the captioning. We are so happy to be here with these fantastic folks who are going to talk to you tonight about their experiences and answer any questions that you might have about navigating on-campus interviews. We're going to start with a panel discussion, and then we'll leave some time for Q&A after. We're also going to take a 5-minute break about halfway through the hour and a half, just so that we can make sure this is an accessible space for everyone, so that you could go to the bathroom, get a snack, whatever you need. We also just generally want to make sure this is an inclusive and accessible space, so feel free to take breaks whenever you need, move around, turn your camera off, on, whatever you need to do. As a reminder, this will be recorded if you miss anything. We also do want to recognize what is going on in the world today. It's scary and it's hard to focus. Please take the space that you need. Please take the space that you need. If you do like this content, we want to remind you to follow the National Disabled Law Students Association, our Twitter, on our social, our Twitter, our Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. Sign up to be a member at endulsa.org. Donate if you have the funds. I'll post that link. And without further ado, I will kick it off to our moderator, Allie Bitts, a 3L at the University of Chicago, to get us started. Thank you so much, Allie.
Awesome. Thank you, Marissa, for putting this together. I'm so excited for this event. As Marissa mentioned, I'm a current 3L at the University of Chicago, and I'm also currently one of the executive board members of UChicago's Disability Rights Organization. So I guess the way to start is if we could have each of our panelists just give a quick introduction, and from there we'll go into our prepared questions. And how about Beth starts and then throw it to the next person?
Sorry, 1 second, just before we get started. For accessibility, if folks who are not presenting could turn off their camera, that would be fantastic. I would really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Sorry, go ahead, Allie.
Awesome, thank you. Yep, you go ahead, Beth.
Great. Well, it's wonderful to be here. My name is Beth Hardcastle. I'm a senior associate at Sidley Austin in Washington, D.C. I'm in the healthcare regulatory group, so I do a lot of work with our life sciences clients. I'm doing kind of a lot of consulting in a lot of ways, even though it is a law firm, solving problems with respect to coverage and coding and reimbursement. But I have a disability myself. I use a wheelchair and went through the OCI process at Stanford Law in 2012. So happy to talk about that. And then also at Sidley Austin, I do a fair bit of recruiting work. So I've have done on-campus interviews when on-campus was a thing back at Stanford, and I'm really involved in interviewing candidates in the DC office. So happy to talk about that as well.
Thank you so much. How about let's have Mason go next.
Sure. Hi, I'm Mason Barney. I am a partner with the law firm of Siri and Glimstad. We are a litigation boutique. I am a commercial litigator is most of my work these days. But we also do about 1/3 of our work is in class actions on the plaintiff side. Prior to this, I was in big firms for about 10 years. I graduated from Brooklyn Law School in 2002. From there, I clerked in the Eastern District of New York, then went to Latham and Watkins as an associate for another 5 years or so. Yeah, so that's basically my work history.
Perfect, thank you. And last but not least, we have Heather.
Hi, everyone. My name is Heather Martone. I am a senior associate in the Labor and Employment Group in Reed Smith's Los Angeles office. Happy to be here today, and bit of my background. I am here to mostly discuss reasonable accommodations and the law in the background of this area. Seems to have a bit of an overlap with Mason. I also graduated from Brooklyn Law School, then clerked also in the Eastern District of New York, and have mostly been in big firms since. So I did some structured finance litigation, but mostly do labor and employment litigation, and I'm barred in both California and New York. So happy to be here today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody. So to jump into our prepared questions, and of course, then we'll have a Q&A afterwards. I was wondering if each of our panelists could just say, a little bit about their on-campus interview experience, especially if you were someone who requested accommodations, just kind of a general overview of how that went, and then we'll dive a little bit further into that.
I'm happy to go first on that. So I did participate in OCI at Stanford. It feels like it was forever ago. I did not request specific accommodations. I knew where OCI would be held, and I knew it would be all in physically accessible rooms and buildings, so I didn't have to specifically request that. But it's a lot. It's intense. I remember, it was 2 weeks at Stanford. And you would, bid for firms, and you would try to see as many as possible to, get the best chances of getting a firm that fit with what you were looking for. I will say that I certainly had some experiences where I wheeled into the room and people, looked at me that look you get if you have a visible disability, and you get that look where the person's just shocked and doesn't really know what to do with the fact that you have a visible disability. I did get that sometimes. I did get a few questions that I think were probably pretty inappropriate, but I think that was rare, and for the most part it was a challenging but good experience. With Sidley Austin, I had 2 interviewers who were in the healthcare group, and immediately, were interested in the fact that I was interested in the healthcare group, and we had a great conversation. Interestingly, I learned later that one of the individuals who interviewed me from Sidley also had a disability, which I didn't know at the time. I don't know if that helped or hurt or whatever, but I think that was interesting, and perhaps gave us a connection that I didn't really even know at the time.
All right. And Mason, do you have any sort of insights about how the OCI process went that would be helpful?
Sure. So yeah, my OCI process was even further back than that. I went through it in 2004, and at Brooklyn, it's mostly the same. You bid for law firms, and I can't remember the exact number, but I think I saw something on the order of, I had like 30 interviews or something in that range. Unlike Beth, my disability is not visible. I have a pretty severe learning disability. I'm a very poor speller. I am not a particularly great writer, or I wasn't until I became a lawyer, basically. And I have a very hard time reading. I'm very slow at reading, and I have attention deficit disorder and organizational issues. So, most of that is stuff that a lawyer actually needs to do. And, through law school, I was able to figure it out, but I kind of knew in law firms it was going to be a bit different. And so as I was going through the interview process, one of the things I had to figure out was which firms are going to accommodate me without my saying anything about that. Because if you go into an interview saying, yeah, I have a hard time reading and writing, but I like to be a lawyer, please. It's it's not going to go over well. And when you've only got a couple of minutes, you can't really go into the explanation of, well, I have this and I have that and I need this, but I can do that. And, let them see the good sides of you. So what I had to do was try and figure out an environment that I thought was going to be accommodating and allow me to thrive. And part of that was identifying things that I would need. So one of the things I had wisely been told by one of my professors to look for was a word processing department. Not every firm at that point had one. I know a lot of firms have since gotten rid of their word processing departments, but it was incredibly helpful to me because I'd be drafting a brief at midnight, and then I just send it to our West Coast word processing department to be proofread. They'd proofread it, they'd send it back to me by 9 a.m. It was great. But when I went into OCI, I didn't know what that really meant, but I had just been told by a professor who knew about my disability, hey, look for this. And so, that was one of the questions I asked, but I tried to sort of include it in other issues that I talked about. And in the end, I actually ended up summering with Sherman and Sterling, which was a great experience, and I enjoyed the firm, but I kind of got I needed an environment that had somewhat more flexibility to it. And so that's why after clerking, I did some more interviewing, and Latham fit a little bit better in terms of sort of my style. And so that's why I ended up there. But it was part of what I learned was, how to figure out what environment was going to work for me without necessarily saying I need XYZ accommodations, because I didn't even really know at that time exactly what accommodations I would need.
Yeah, and as a follow-up for both you and Beth, do you have any tips for kind of reading those nonverbal cues or those small things to understand if it's going to be a firm that will be accommodating? Is there any sort of advice you have on how to kind of suss that out?
Well, Beth may have a slightly different because of the visible disability. For me, it was as much a feeling as anything else. It was sort of a comfortableness. I knew, like I said, I probably didn't want a rigid environment. I didn't want the traditional white shoe, which it turned out Sherman and Sterling was a bit more of the traditional white shoe law firm. And so I wanted something else, and trying to work through that with the interviewer. It was kind of a gut feeling thing for me.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Mason said. I think it is a bit of a gut feeling. I mean, when you're on for OCI, you typically will just meet one or two people from the firm, so it's a little bit limited. But if you get an interview then back at the office or virtual office, you'll be meeting possibly 5, 6, 7 people. And I think at that point you can get a pretty good sense of kind of the culture of the firm. What people do they want to put forward for the interviews? Is it a more accommodating, diverse environment, or perhaps something different? So I completely agree that it is kind of intangible and more of a feeling sometimes. I would also say though, I would recommend checking the websites and seeing both the firm's websites and then maybe like Chambers and some of the third-party websites too. Sidley specifically talks about disability in their diversity page, and I know a lot of other firms do too, but not all. And so I think it would be helpful to maybe see if disability is kind of one of the categories of diversity that they are promoting and interested in.
Perfect. And I know you touched a little bit on this, Beth, but for you and Mason, I guess, kind of on the visible disability versus invisible disability spectrum, what was the environment kind of like during those interviews? What did you really experience?
Sure. They varied based on the interviewer. Some of them were extremely formal, asking really specific questions about law classes and maybe papers I had written or other experiences that are on my resume. Some firms seemed, particularly interested in grades, whereas others didn't really look at the transcript. Same with the writing sample. So it really varied by interviewer. Others were extremely casual, and they'd want to talk about the hobbies that you might have listed at the end of your resume. One of the interviews that I had that wasn't Sidley Austin, but that I really enjoyed, and I almost went to that firm. She saw that I was a swimmer based on my resume, and she was a swimmer, and we ended up just talking about swimming and kind of making a personal connection. So they kind of ran the whole gamut. And then, on the bad side, there were some that were more uncomfortable, where someone might ask, a question that they shouldn't about, like, in my case, they asked how I could keep up typing because my hands are affected by my disability, which obviously is not an appropriate question during an interview. But again, that was rare, and most of them were, appropriate.
Yeah, I actually I had an interesting situation with that. This didn't happen during the actual on-campus portion. It happened during one of the back at the law firm interviews. But if you Google my name, I wrote a couple of articles when I was in college about being a college student with a learning disability. And one of the interviewers had found those. And basically, he didn't come right out and say it at first. He more talked about, I think he just brought up ADD generally. And then he said, so I saw your article in Edupedia, and, my stomach sort of dropped a little bit. I ended up, he was very nice about it in terms of, his son had ADD as well. So in the end, it ended up being a good thing that he brought it up, but it was definitely not something I was prepared for. So, I think nowadays people are more used to Googling themselves, but back in the Stone Age, it was something that I hadn't done as much as I should have beforehand. And, in terms of the environment itself, one of the issues that I had was I was concerned about timing and making the next interview. And at one point made the silly mistake of saying, oh, I think I have to go to my next one, which that firm did not appreciate. But yeah, I mean, most of the interviews, they really did vary between, as Beth said, people who were very interested in grades or my journal work or stuff like that, all the way up to someone who just said, so you're from Boston, what do you think of the Sox this year? And, we talked Red Sox for pretty much the entire interview. Now having to hire people, I can tell you that, both approaches have their merit, because you're trying to figure out not just is someone qualified to do this job, but is this someone you want to work with? And for you, even if they are just, having to talk about the Red Sox, what they're doing is trying to figure out, is this someone I want to spend time with for 8 to 12 hours to 15 to 16 hours a day? And, it was not quite what I had expected, as I hadn't really interviewed too much before I went to law school. So that was, getting used to people not just quizzing me about my resume, but also just trying to engage me in regular conversation and see what I'm like, was something that put me off a little bit at first, but, since then I have realized the value in that.
Thank you. Yeah, and as you mentioned, there's the on-campus interviewing portion of OCI, but there's also the callback portion. And that's something that you might, not have as much control over. For either of you, were there any different considerations when it came to the actual callback portion as opposed to the actual on-campus interviews, or was that not as much of a consideration?
It's a great question. I think for OCI, I was so focused on just trying to get as many callbacks as possible. You just want to put your best foot forward and really give yourself as many options as possible. I think then for the in the office interviews, whether virtual or not, I was trying to get more of a sense of what the firm was actually like. And so I actually felt like I was maybe asking more questions or being more thoughtful about, who I was speaking to and what the firm was like, to try to make sure that, I made a good fit and it was a good match based on, what final offers I would get.
Yeah, my experience was very similar in that when I went into the law firms, I was looking at, what is the environment like? What are the people like? What are the facilities like? Do they have a gym? Do they have showers? Do they have, a quiet room, which sometimes I do need. And so, and all the way down to, do they share offices? Do they, because, for me, having someone else in the room is going to be very distracting and that might not be a great thing. And then with the people, most of my questions were, I tried to figure out individual questions to the best extent I could. If I got a list of interviewers beforehand, I would always Google them and see if I could, see what they've been working on lately or something along those lines, and try and engage them in that type of conversation. And, when all else fails, just sort of asked about, what life is like at the firm, to try and understand who the people were, because that I think now, looking in hindsight, was what really made the decision for me, more so than any other factor. Was, where did I feel comfortable? Where was the place that I thought, the people are most like myself? And so that's just not something you can ask a question on. That's something you gotta figure out on your own later. And also just remember, people in interviews can sometimes be if not necessarily their normal selves. I had an interesting on-campus interview experience where I met a guy and he was talking all about the trial he had just done and the hours he had pulled, and what a sweatshop that firm was. And I then met him years later. He ended up at Olshan, the same firm I was at, and we became very good friends, but in part because, we sort of both work at the same hard, long hour pace. And, I brought up what he was saying to me, and he said, no, you totally missed it. I was trying to explain why it's great to work those long hours with great people. So yeah, it was an interesting experience where I took what he was saying totally differently than he was putting it out.
All right. I would love to bring in Heather at this point. So Heather knows a lot about employment law, and she's kind of our expert here. And so we'd love it if you could just tell us a little bit about accommodations, who's responsible for them, what kind of accommodations can be given, all that kind of stuff.
Sure. So obviously there is a ton of information in this area, and I'm just going to start briefly on it. Want to make sure that, we leave time for any questions that could come up later. So I want to focus on obviously the interview process. So the American with Disabilities Act, or ADA, makes it unlawful for an employer to discriminate against a qualified applicant with a disability. And so the ADA applies to any private employer that has 15 or more employees, and also obviously to government employers. So the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, which you'll commonly hear it referred to as, enforces the employment provisions of the ADA. And so kind of the hallmark we're looking at here is that an applicant with a disability, like any other applicant, must meet the essential requirements of the job, but has the ability to perform those with what we call a reasonable accommodation. An employer does not have to provide a reasonable accommodation, though, which would cause the employer an undue hardship, which might be significant difficulty or expense, but they will have to provide an accommodation that's reasonable. So let's talk kind of a bit more about that. So under the ADA, employers have to provide reasonable accommodations, which is any kind of change or adjustment to enable you to be considered for a job opening. An employer cannot refuse to consider you because you require a reasonable accommodation to compete for or perform a job. So for instance, if you have someone, in kind of a classic example is if someone is disabled and using a wheelchair, and normally interviews are held on the second floor, there is a building that does not have an elevator, it would not be reasonable to require an elevator to be put in. However, it would be reasonable to say, let's have this interview on the first floor where it is accessible. So that kind of describes, in particular example, what is an undue hardship. So it would be significant difficulty or significant expense for the employer to put in an elevator. So an employer can refuse an accommodation that is an undue hardship, but there needs to be that alternative accommodation. So some examples of reasonable accommodations would be providing written materials in accessible formats like Braille or large print, providing a reader or sign language interpreter, ensuring that interviews and other parts of the process are held in accessible locations. Those are kind of probably the biggest ones we're thinking of when we're applying for and interviewing with jobs. So kind of the biggest is asking for an accommodation. So an employer may ask you whether you will need a reasonable accommodation for the hiring process. And the way you can request it yourself is really to just inform the employer as part of your medical condition. So what can happen if you request this accommodation? The employer may need to discuss the accommodation with you. They may need to understand your disability more and ask questions. So that way they can get at what type of accommodation is needed. So there's definitely more about accommodation once you get a job offer and then actually started a job. I don't want to touch on that since our time's brief, but if anyone has questions on that later, please feel free to ask. But the big last thing I want to talk about is determining the best moment to tell a prospective employer about the need for a reasonable accommodation. This is a completely personal process. You're not required to disclose anything at this point. You may choose to inform your employer during the application process so that they can better understand what you need, but some people wait until they have a job offer or if they've started at the job. And so it's really just a very fact-intensive inquiry where you have to decide, is this going to come up that I should talk about this now, or do I want to talk about this now? So kind of a three-step process we like to talk about to break this down is, number one, should I disclose my disability? So is my disability readily apparent? Well, I need an accommodation for part of the interview process. And just to speak a bit personally there, I have anaphylactic food allergies to nuts. So a lot of the extended interviews for jobs would lead to a part where you would have a meal. And I would have to consider if I wanted to discuss that in advance or just wait until I got to a restaurant. So things like that can kind of come up under that particular element. Have you had an accommodation before in school or work? So all of that would be important. And then number 2 is definitely the timing. So when should I disclose this? So you may want to think, does disclosure at any of these stages get me closer to the next round of the hiring process where I can get the accommodation I need? So lots of options there. Do you disclose it in your cover letter, a screening interview, a callback interview while you're working? So again, very personal choice. And the last part, which I think our panelists have kind of touched on, is just really doing your due diligence on where you're applying. So does the firm or organization I'm applying to seem to be a group that's going to support disability? Is there a resource or affinity group for people who have disabilities? Have I researched the firm to see if they seem to have hiring practices that discuss accommodations? All of these are part of those like soft factors you can see yourself if this seems to be a place that's accommodating. And so just the last thing I wanted to say for now is that obviously there is a point to take this into the legal side, and you should know your legal rights. Again, up to you if you want to pursue them. But if you did feel discriminated against and that you were not given a reasonable accommodation, that is where you can file a charge with the EEOC under the ADA, saying that you were discriminated against for your disability. And so that's kind of all I have to say at the moment, and I'll toss it back to Allie.
Perfect. Super helpful. I'm sure more people will have questions about that closer to the end when we have our Q&A section. I did kind of want to go back to what you talked about a little bit at the end, where you spoke about disclosing a disability if it's not exactly obvious. And I was actually hoping, Mason talked about this a little bit, if he could give a little bit more about his personal experience of deciding when and how to disclose something that maybe you don't need accommodations for the interview.
Sure, yeah. So this is it's a bit of a difficult, it was a difficult thing for me. I have in the past had some jobs where I disclosed right up front. I used to be a computer programmer. So the fact that I couldn't spell, the fact that I'm a slow reader, the fact that I'm a little disorganized, that wasn't going to sink my job prospects. So I used to disclose right away. But I had a boss who later said to me, look, that's not necessarily who you are, and that didn't necessarily give the same impression as what I know you're capable of. And so when I went into law firms, I didn't disclose initially. What I decided to do, and again, this is because my disability is not visible. What I decided to do was to work for a little while, show them the quality of what I could do, and then disclose after the fact, after they kind of knew who I was, knew what I was capable of. As I said, I used the facilities that were available, that I didn't necessarily need to ask for, like the word processing department, or my secretary. I just simply said to my secretary, when the first day I was hired, hey, I'm sometimes a little disorganized, so can you just go through and make sure my calendar is always up to date with all the various cases I have? Can you do that like once a week? And that was extremely helpful for me in staying organized, but at the same time wasn't necessarily something that I had to say, hey, I've got a disability and therefore I need this. And then eventually, after at Latham, I think it was a year in, at Olshan, I think it was about 6 months or so, I mentioned my disability to some of the partners that I was working with, initially as more of a side conversation. Oh yeah, no, I have ADD, and I grew up with a severe learning disability, and that allowed me to then talk to them about the accommodations that I did use, and then be able to say to them, hey, can I get this to you at 9 a.m. tomorrow? I need word processing to look at it. 9 times out of 10, it wasn't a big deal. But then the 10th time, after I came out, they understood a little bit better. So I kind of did a middle ground in that I tried to make sure that I put my best foot forward without necessarily giving the wrong impression about where my strengths were.
Perfect. So next, I think it'd be good to hear about a little bit of your actual experience as an associate with a disability at a law firm. Just kind of what it was like, what accommodations you used, anything that you think might be helpful. And maybe Beth can start with that one.
Sure. I love my job. I love being a lawyer. I love that I do all my pro bono work in disability rights. Sidley is a really welcoming place that I think supports diversity. I'm involved in the diversity committee and have been involved in the summer committee and in recruiting. And I think that's evidence that Sidley is putting their diverse, including lawyers with disabilities forward, which I've really valued. I think an experience at a law firm is going to vary so much for people based on the firm, the group, the people that they tend to work with. I found that being in kind of a smaller group within a large law firm was really helpful in having kind of this built-in set of mentors that were looking out for you from day one. So I've really enjoyed that aspect. It can be challenging. Well, it is challenging. You are doing a lot of cutting edge, interesting, important work for clients. It can be long hours and very intense, but I've also found it very rewarding. I also think it changes a lot over time. As a junior associate, I wasn't always sure what project was going to come next, and so it's sometimes hard to schedule, personal life or activities. But as a more senior associate, it's a little bit easier now that I know kind of what my clients typically are going to ask for and kind of the general timeline of projects. So I think that has also made it easier to have a bit of a better work-life balance than maybe I did as a junior associate.
Thank you. And Mason, yeah?
Yeah, certainly that the work-life balance was definitely something that took some getting used to. Though that was something that, as I was doing my second round of interviews after clerking, I tried to focus a little bit more on in terms of looking at, talking with people about their kids or their hobbies or other stuff to understand, where they put their emphasis. And, I found Latham was great in terms of understanding that, look, you're going to work really freaking hard, but we all have lives outside, and a well-rounded person is going to be the ones that are going to be able to give good advice. In terms of being an associate, I 100% agree with Beth on, finding your mentors. That was invaluable at every law firm I've worked at as an associate, was finding mentors, people who you like to work with and who like working with you, who you can learn from, who can watch out for you a little bit, who can be able to say to someone else, hey, yeah, no, that guy, he's good. I work with him a lot. You should put him on the more interesting task rather than, the less interesting task. I, coming from being a clerk, I actually jumped in as a second year. And so I never did doc review on as the primary reviewer. The first doc review I ever actually had to do was when the senior associate looked at me when I was a third year and said, so Mason, you're going to run the doc review on this. And I said, sure, yes, absolutely, no problem. And then went to one of my other mentors and said, how do you do a doc review? I've never done it. What software do we use? And you learn. But having those people, who you can go to and ask the questions was incredibly valuable. And even at the big law firms, there are small groups, there are group activities, there are lunches, there are panel discussions sometimes. Going to those things and meeting people in a somewhat less formal setting was really valuable. And then getting to know them more as we did cases together. I made some great friends who, 15 years on are still friends of mine. And as a partner now, there's people who send me cases, which, not a bad thing. So, these environments, everyone knows that when you come in as a first year, you're not a seasoned lawyer. They don't expect you to know everything. One of the advantages of going to a larger law firm, I found, was that the training for their associates was top notch. Between deposition training, writing training, accounting classes that we did, getting that experience, even though I was pretty sure that big law life wasn't going to be for me forever. Getting that training, getting that experience was great. Now I can also say smaller law firms, some of them are very dedicated to training, very dedicated to, bringing up their junior associates. In my firm, my partner and I both came out of Latham. We both had that attitude of, bring people in and teach them how to be good lawyers. And that's part of the profession. And so, that's what we do. We always have a first, second, third year working with us, and we spend the time not only to say, okay, here are my edits, but to say, okay, here's why I made this edit, here's why I made that edit. And so it's expected that that's going to happen. And to an extent, finding again those mentors who you can go to and say, okay, so why did you change this? So I can understand for next time. I said earlier that I wasn't a good writer, and when I read things that I wrote before law school, I'm a little shocked that I even got into law school. But over time, I really put in the effort talking to people, getting them to tell me, okay, why did you cut out that great opening line that I wrote? Or why did you put in this aphorism? Or, why are we not making XYZ argument? Asking those questions and being able to get those answers, over the course of time, I built up essentially a library in my head of how to be a good writer. And so despite my disability making it really challenging for me, and I'm still an incredibly slow writer, having great people to work with, great senior associates, great partners who, I got to know and got to befriend, helped me in being able to become a better writer and a better lawyer.
Perfect. And that seems like a perfect place for us to take our pause. So we are going to do a 5-minute break. We will be back at 5:50, but we definitely have more questions for this panel. And of course, we're going to leave ample room for Q&A. So take your 5-minute break, be back here at 5:50, and we'll keep going.
That is 6:50 Eastern and 3:50 Pacific and 4:50 Mountain. I think.
Thank you. I apologize. I'm in Chicago right now.
Thanks, everyone. Hi, everyone. This is Marissa. Welcome back. I hope that everybody is back, but can't see anyone because everybody's cameras are off. So I hope y'all are back. I realized that at the beginning, I forgot to give a description of what I look like. I am a white woman with dark brown hair. It is in a ponytail. I'm wearing black glasses and I'm wearing a black and white blouse. Um, and a quick housekeeping note, just for folks who are presenting, if everyone can just say their name before they speak, just for accessibility purposes, that would be awesome. And without further ado, I will kick it back to Allie, our fantastic moderator, to get the panel started again. Thank you all so much, and I hope you enjoyed your break.
Thank you, Marissa. So this is Allie again. Apologies for that from before. So we have obviously two panelists here who have noted that they've worked on the recruiting side at a law firm as well. So I was hoping that both of our panelists could talk a little bit about their views on OCI, recruitment, and especially disability in that process from the recruiting side as they've seen it.
I'm sure. This is Beth. I'm happy to take that one first. I love doing the OCI interviews back at Stanford when they were in person. I'm doing them for Harvard actually next week, I think, for Sidley, virtually. It's so fun to go back to campus and meet the students. They're so eager and excited, which I always really enjoy. It really was interesting the first time I did OCI at Stanford from the recruiting perspective, because it's certainly not as stressful as it is for the students, but it's a long day. You have 20 or 30-minute interviews back to back. Sometimes you get a lunch break, but sometimes you have students that want to meet with you because they couldn't get on your schedule otherwise, which we always are happy to do. So it's a pretty nonstop day, and then afterwards you meet with your. I usually would go with a partner, and I would meet with the partner and discuss kind of our top line views of people right off the bat, talk about maybe our top 5 or 10, and then think about it. And then the next day or whenever we're back in the DC office, meet with the recruiting chairs to kind of give our overview of who we think would be a good fit. I think, one tip that I give students during the OCI process is to the extent it's true, to be really enthusiastic about the firm that you're interviewing with. Just as much as you're trying to find a good fit for a firm, we're trying to find students that we think are a good fit. And, particularly when I go back to Stanford, my alma mater, I really want to bring students back to Sidley. I want those students to get hired. I want them to be successful at Sidley. And so I'm really looking for students that definitely want to come to Sidley. And I think that's true for other firms too. We only have a set number of people that we give callback interviews for. And we don't want to give those interviews to people that aren't really that interested in DC or aren't that interested in Sidley. So we're really looking at that as we make our decisions too. From a disability perspective, I'm a huge advocate for disability rights and disability issues. So if a student comes in with a visible disability or discloses an invisible disability, or maybe just from their resume, it's clear because they're in a disability affiliation organization or something, for me, that's just a positive. So I love to see that. I love to see people who have a disability and are interested in Sidley and interested in DC. So it really is just a positive from my perspective.
Yeah, I'd again second what Beth said in terms of enthusiasm for the firm. I remember when I was in law school, it was a little hard sometimes to differentiate one firm from another, but I can tell you I had a very good friend, and at Brooklyn, what law firms would interview you were largely based on your class ranking. And she really wanted to go to Paul Weiss. She wanted to do litigation. She knew that, but she didn't make their cutoff for who they were going to interview. And so, like Beth said, during a lunch break, she just sought out the Paul Weiss interviewer and said, "Hey, do you have any time? Can I?" And talked about how much she really wanted Paul Weiss because she wanted to do litigation, and they had a great litigation department. She was sincere about it, and she ended up not only getting a interview but a job at Paul Weiss. So showing that, is finding a law firm that, or two or three, that you really do like, and showing that is very important. One of the things you've got to remember on the OCI interviewing side is the interviewer is going to see a lot of students in a day, and they've got to remember, they'll take notes, they'll have your resume, and it'll jog their memories. But I know for me, the people who had something that stood out, like, oh, I really like Latham. I know that you guys did this case recently, and I read it in class, and it was great, et cetera, et cetera. Or just someone who, went out of their way to make a connection with me, who had read my bio and knew what I was doing, who asked me about the pro bono work that I was doing. That really did stand out in my mind as I was then going back through and trying to figure out and make the cuts. And the other thing I would say, as I mentioned earlier, is that sometimes it also just comes down to chemistry. Is this a Sidley Austin type person? Is this a Latham type person? Is this a Paul Weiss type person? And so, sometimes that's all that it is a feeling that, I think this person would fit in. I think, one of the partners at Latham that I used to work for used to say, it's the beer test. Would you want to go out and have a beer with this person? And so, that, as much as anything, really was a important factor. And, being able to show who you are is good in that sense, because it will help the interviewer figure out, are you the type of person they like at that law firm? But also for you, it'll save you from necessarily going to law firms that may not be a good fit for you. There are a lot of great law firms out there. There are a lot of top tier law firms where you'll get great work. You'll get interesting cases. You'll get very good supervisors and great training. And then the question really comes down to, what's the best fit for you? For some people, it's, oh, I want to do antitrust, and this law firm has a great antitrust department. Okay, great. But I suspect for the majority of people, they don't have a laser-like focus. And so it really comes down to, where are they going to feel the most comfortable? And that's, at my current law firm, that's one of the criteria that we use. We are a small law firm. Especially this year, we've been all virtual. And so, trying to figure out who's the type of person who I'm going to want to be on the phone with for 2 hours on a conference call, or that I can say, hey, do this, and know that it's going to get done and not have to stand over them. that's what we're looking for, as much as, do I think this person can do the job? Do I think this person has the chops? Especially at most big law firms, they assume if you're coming in the door, you've already been screened and you can do the work. So the question really is, are you the type of person we like to hire?
Thank you. Thank you, Mason, for speaking. And this is Allie again. We have one last prepared question, and then we'll go right on to Q&A. So for our very last prepared question, obviously for Mason and Beth, they both went through the OCI process, started out as junior associates, and are now in more senior positions. Is there anything that now you're in a more senior position that you want to change within your firm, or that you have changed within your firm in order to make it more accessible or accommodating, or anything of that nature?
Sure. This is Beth. One thing that I'm really proud of that I did actually when I was a junior, so I didn't even wait till I was a senior associate, was Sidley had this great 1L diversity scholarship program. I think it was started by the DC office. I think it was started by associates who wanted to build a diversity program. And previously it did not, it listed different types of diversity that would be considered for the scholarship, and disability was not listed. I don't think it was intentionally not listed, just no one had raised it before. And so I think when I was a second year associate, at that point I was already, friends with the recruiting department and the diversity committee, and felt comfortable asking them, why this was the case and if they could add disability as one of the considered diverse categories. It was not an issue at all. They agreed to immediately, and it's been on there ever since. This wasn't led by me, but Sidley did establish a few years ago a disability alliance of lawyers with disabilities at the firm. We have quarterly meetings, and I think that's a fantastic development as well.
Yeah, this is Mason. That's really interesting, Beth, that you say about the diversity, the disability diversity group. At Latham, I kind of went in a slightly different direction. I noticed that the law firm had programs that they had put together for pro bono. So they would work with, for example, the Legal Aid Society on immigrant issues, or I think they work with Legal Aid also on appellate work, but they didn't have anything for disability. And so one of the things I did as I got a little more senior was I contacted one of the organizations in New York that works with kids with disabilities, and they already had a program where they were working with law firms to get representation for students in special education hearings. And so I lobbied the law firm to do that, and they agreed, and I then made sure I mentored student or younger associates below me to help establish that project, and I kept that going through at Olshan as well. And I think the other thing that, as I already mentioned, the training was something that I found invaluable. As I said, I am not cut out. I wasn't genetically cut out to be a lawyer, in some ways, at least, if you just listen to my disability. And having the great training is what really made a difference. And that's something that, as I have become more senior, I have really focused on with junior associates, is training and making sure that I explain why things are and why we do things and how we do them. And understanding that different people learn differently in that in that project, in that development path, it was invaluable for me.
All right, thank you so much to all of our panelists. We obviously had Mason, Beth, and Heather with us today. And now it is time for our Q&A portion where you can ask any questions you have. So to make this easiest, feel free if you have a question to just unmute yourself and shout out. If that doesn't work for you, you can always chat me as well, or Marissa, or just put it in the chat. But feel free to just unmute and ask.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for hosting this event. My name is James Mills, and I'm a disabled veteran. I am not honestly used to this kind of open atmosphere, so this, in addition to being informative, has been really encouraging. I've struggled with the idea of being seen as, a disabled student who is also a strong candidate instead of a strong candidate who has or despite disabilities, and this has been great. One of my major blocks so far has been finding those mentors we've discussed. I left my long-established network behind just as everything closed down, so finding and forming those interpersonal connections to draw information from has been difficult. Beyond reaching out over email and events such as this one, what else would you recommend we do to help connect with people who can help us get our footing?
Well, thanks, James. That's a great question. I think it can definitely be hard to get your foot in the door at a firm if you don't know somebody who's already there. But I know you said in addition to emails, but I do think that just the cold emails, not really cold calling, but cold emails is a good option. I've had a number of students with disabilities who are interested in Sidley or just interested in, what it's like at a law firm to reach out to me and ask to do a short call, or back when we could meet in person to do coffee. And I'm always happy to do that. So I do think that those can be helpful. I know Sidley and a lot of other firms have summer associate or summer events for law students. I'm honestly not sure what those look like right now during the pandemic, but those can be great ways to kind of initially meet people and form mentoring relationships as well. I will say that before I started at Sidley, I didn't really know anyone there or have any real relationships or connections with people. It wasn't until I was an associate that I formed those relationships. And as Mason was talking about, those mentoring relationships are just so invaluable, once you're actually an associate too.
I feel like in some ways I'm Beth's echo on some stuff because she gives great advice. I agree on the cold emailing. I've used that in a number of different situations over the years. A lot of times reaching out to people just to say, hi, I'm so-and-so, and I am interested in doing whatever it is. So for example, when I left Big Law, I wasn't quite sure what I did want to do next. And so I spent a fair amount of time looking and thinking. And one of the things I was thinking about was becoming a e-discovery specialist. And so I went out and cold emailed Brooklyn Law School graduates who I could find who were listed as e-discovery specialists. And almost all of them emailed me back. Generally speaking, people are always happy to talk about what they do. And some of those people were then able to help me. Some of them were able to help me find a job. Some of them were able to help me just learn more about the industry and learn more about what they do. In law school, one of the other things that I did was I did a number of clinics, which, at the time I thought I wanted to do criminal law. Obviously my interest changed over time, but I made it a point to do criminal law clinics and meet people who were in the DA's office and the U.S. Attorney's office. In fact, I'm still in touch with the woman who I worked under at the U.S. Attorney's office. It doesn't hurt that she ended up being an extremely senior AUSA in the Eastern District, and I actually have encountered her professionally. But staying in touch with those people who I met in my clinics was a great way of doing it. And again, a lot of that was just cold emailing. You know, I email her, hey, it's great. I've been working at so-and-so now, blah, blah, blah. I get back a 2-line email. I mean, from her, yeah, great, Happy New Year. But, you know, having an excuse to email someone who you have met before is great. You know, one of the other things that a older lawyer taught me, and that I've been trying to do more recently, is, you know, in your mind, keep a list of the people you've met and what their interests are. And when you see a article in that interest that they might be interested in, just use that as an excuse to email, say, hey, no, we haven't talked in a while, but I saw this and thought of you. And it just gets the conversation going again. And so that type of sort of networking was a skill that I had to learn for sure. And I didn't do it right every time, but it was a really valuable skill later.
This is Marissa, just real quick, our wonderful director of accommodations at Endulsa, Beth Karp, put in the chat that if you write to us at info@endulsa.org, we can also connect you to some disabled law students and lawyers. One other thing I will say is that events like these are super helpful, but they also are a great way to expose you to different disabled lawyers, and they're great networking tools as well. So looking for events as an excuse to sort of connect with folks is also a really great tool.
Thank you so much. Like I said, this has been really encouraging and informative, and it means a lot. Thank you for your time. That's some very good advice.
And actually, if I may, just one thing, James, I was thinking, you know, you mentioned that you were a veteran, and, you know, that may be an area that you can use as an entree point. You know, trying to work the veteran network. I mean, I know a lot of lawyers who are veterans, and you know, a number of them are regularly talking to other junior lawyers who were also veterans. So yeah, and I just also wanted to say thank you for your service. You know, that's really great. It's a really great experience, I know, for a lot of people that I've worked with and they found very valuable as a lawyer.
This is Marissa. A lot of firms also do have veteran affinity groups as well if they don't have disability affinity groups, just so that, in case you don't know. You may know that already though, so that might not be helpful.
No, I really appreciate it. I plan on sharing this information with some folks that couldn't make it tonight. So thank you again. It's been really encouraging, and I appreciate it more than you know.
Hi, this is Olivia. I have a question. So I'm actually a 3L, so I'm looking for my first actual full-time job, which is a little bit similar. I never actually participated in OCI. I just went through Indeed. But I have a question about pay. I know there's a pay gap generally between people who have disabilities and those who don't when they're working. And one thing that I'm kind of concerned about is, like, if my accommodation is I need more time to work on things and I bill the client for more time, aren't firms going to be like, well, you're charging the client more because the amount of time that you're spending on something takes longer than an attorney without a disability? And I just kind of wanted to know whether that's something that comes up at all or that you've had to discuss with an employer.
I'd like to jump in here from the legal employment side of it. This is Heather speaking. So the laws have actually been updated in many US states, so it depends where you're seated. Employers are not allowed to ask salary history. So I bring that up because that's an important issue for pay gap as well. So you mentioned this is your first full-time job, but this can come up, say you go somewhere now and you change and go to a different firm. They're not allowed to ask you what amount of money did you make at your last job? And the point of that is to prevent pay inequality. So if you're paid less, then that would set you up for continually being paid less. Now, as far as taking more time to do something, I can't speak to that. I'll definitely leave that to the other panelists. I don't see legally how they could choose to say, you know, you're performing this way and someone else isn't, just because as someone who's been in a bunch of big firms myself, everyone works on kind of like different levels, different speeds. Like someone may not be disabled, but still just need longer to do something. So I wouldn't worry about it that end. And then if you do wind up in some of the bigger firms, it's a lockstep method. So everyone gets the same salary there. But I'll turn it to the other panelists for their personal experiences.
Yeah, this is Mason. That's certainly something I have encountered throughout my career. You know, I do take longer. I mean, there's just no way around it. I can't read as quickly. I can't write as quickly. What I found was that is, you know, like Heather has said, I think earlier tonight, you know, they can't ask you about that. They can't force you to say, yes, the reason why I take longer is because I have to rewrite the same sentence 7 times to get the right grammar, for Pete's sake. But what I found is, there are some cases, especially in larger firms, but also in smaller firms, where the hours are more flexible, shall we say. You know, I tended to get put on bet the company cases when I was at Latham, because what's an extra $50,000 on a $4 million bill? It, you know, and my skill set was good enough that the firms liked that. You know, I also found that sort of selling myself, not necessarily as someone who works slowly, you know, which I recognize that I do, and I say that here, but as someone who works carefully, as someone who, oh yeah, no, you know, I spent an hour on this research, but I really feel like there's something out there that I just haven't found. I just need another hour for it. You know, the way you present it can make a lot of difference. And lastly, as I said earlier, I found that once you sort of make an impression, once you show the law firm, hey, I can do this work. If you go to them and say, you know, the reason why I actually take longer is because of X, Y, and Z, they're going to care an awful lot less. And so, you know, it's a combination of knowing your skills, a combination how you present your skills, and how you position yourself and the cases that you choose. And, you know, especially when you're at a junior level, you know, first, second, third years in big law firms, I've seen partners, and I have personally gone through and gone, yeah, 8 hours, 4 hours, 6 hours, 2 hours. And that's just, you expect that some of that is going to go on. You know, as you get more senior, it becomes a bigger issue, I found. But, you know, there were plenty of times when, if you knew the client was price sensitive, you know, you did what you had to do in terms of the hours. You know, no one likes to write things off that they can't make money on, but at the same time, a certain amount of that is expected for junior associates.
Yeah, I now it's my turn to say that I completely agree with everything that Mason said. I thought that was perfect and is exactly the same as my experiences. You know, I just to kind of reiterate, as someone who does review bills at this point and does manage junior associates, I mean, first year associates are going to take 2 or 3 times as long to do something that a senior associate would do anyway, regardless of disability, just because they're still learning and they're, you know, getting up to speed. So I think, you know, I've participated in a lot of different panels before, and back when I was in law school, I was part of an organization like this one. So I've gotten this question a lot, and I think in practice, it's one that is less of an issue than I think students think. So not to say you shouldn't, you know, your feelings of being concerned about it are 100% valid, but I think in practice, you know, you do, just as Mason said, we do write off junior associate time There will be cost sensitive clients where we just say you can only bill 2 or 3 hours to this, and maybe it takes you 3 or 4, but you just bill the 2 or 3 because that's kind of what you've been instructed to do. And then there are those cases that are less cost sensitive, and so there's less concern about that. But yeah, I just agree with what the group has said.
This is Liv. No, thank you so much. It's really helpful, and it just brought my anxiety about that down from a 10 to a 2. So I really appreciate it.
Does anyone else have any other questions? Okay, I have a question if not. This is Marissa. So I actually have a question that is probably more directed at Heather. So the complicated thing about OCI is that a lot of times schools are involved in the process. And sometimes schools even prevent students from reaching out to firms who are involved in the process. So when that happens, how does the law apply in those cases? And who is responsible for delivering accommodations in those cases?
Sure. Just to clarify, you mean that they prevent a student from meeting with a firm because of a disability, or you're talking a bit broader?
This is Marissa. No, they don't prevent them from meeting with the firm, but they prevent students from reaching out in advance or communicating directly with the firm until the interview. So it would pretty much be impossible to disclose in advance, to request accommodations in advance. So a lot of things would have to pretty much go through the school.
Sure, understood. So this is Heather responding. So Marissa's talking about a situation where you can't reach out, right? So you don't have this information yet to reach out, because it's always best, if you're looking for an accommodation, to disclose to start the dialogue. In that situation, let me take it twofold. First, I would decide if you think you need an accommodation for the OCI process. If it's a situation where, so for example, for me, I have a food allergy. OCI is on just 20-minute interviews. There's no meal. I wouldn't have felt the need to reach out for that issue, right? But if you have a disability where you know that you need maybe you need to have a sign language interpreter or such. If you need that, you would want to reach out to the school then and explain the situation. So this is all under the ADA. The ADA protects your privacy as well, so that's important. I would definitely reach out to whoever is the person involved with the OCI process. Probably someone in career planning is who I would assume. And, I would say to them, I need a sign language interpreter for XYZ interview. I know we don't have the contact information yet. Can you help facilitate that? And they should be, more than willing to do so. I know some schools have disability offices. And so if you've asked for accommodations for school generally before, that's also a good person to bring it up to. It's really about your comfort level, but do be assured that the ADA protects all of this information and no one can further disclose without you giving your okay to that.
Thank you so much, Heather.
Sure.
If we don't have another question, I just wanted to make one sort of general comment that I had meant to make earlier and I'd forgotten. One of the things I have found as a person with a disability is the normal way of doing stuff doesn't always work for me. I've always had to figure out another way. So for example, I keep using this as an example, but I'm a slow reader. And so I've had to figure out how to skim and read, not have to read the whole thing, or figure out, other solutions other than sitting down and reading, say, 100-page case, and what that has meant is I have had a lifetime of training in thinking differently, in thinking sort of outside the box. And as I became more senior, I realized in some ways that's an incredible asset. And I would sell myself as, look, I'm the guy in the room that's going to say the thing that people aren't thinking of, the way to attack a problem that no one else has thought of, because I think differently. I have a different approach to problems sometimes. And, really that comes from having to do that for my disability. And as a result, I find that has been a valuable thing that I'm able to bring to firms. And so in some ways, having a disability has almost been a good thing in my career trajectory, because it has allowed me to stand out in the crowd. It has allowed me to, my wife, who is, she's actually a disability civil rights lawyer. And, she has cerebral palsy, so she has a visible disability. But, whenever we have this discussion about, well, should I mention that I have a disability in a certain situation, one of the things she always reminds me of is, you've accomplished a lot, and someone who hears that you've accomplished a lot with a disability, it's almost more impressive. And so, in some, it's something that I encourage when I talk to people with disabilities in situations like this. I encourage them to think of it that way as you're approaching issues in the law, as you're approaching how to sell yourself, as you're approaching how to position yourself. Is, sometimes it's good to show them who you are before you ask for the accommodation, as I said, but sometimes it's also great to lean into it.
Thank you so much for that, Mason. This is Marissa. Does anybody else have any other closing thoughts before we wrap up?
I actually would like to jump in with something I didn't have a chance to cover earlier, just so I feel like everyone has all the information they need. And it almost piggybacks a bit on what Mason was saying. But on the other side, do you want to disclose at this point if you have a disability? So I just want to make sure everyone does realize that the ADA prohibits employers from asking certain questions that are likely to reveal if you have a disability before making a job offer. So they're not allowed to ask anything like that. Now, practically, if you're asking for an accommodation as part of the interview process or application process, they'll find out there's a disability, but they're not able to just outright ask you that. After you have a job offer, they can ask you if there is something that you would need like a reasonable accommodation for, and it's reasonable to question whether a disability could pose a difficulty for the job or anything of that sort. So you're not required, again, to disclose at any particular time, but just be wary that if, questions start to get uncomfortable, a bit like what Beth said in one of her interviews, you may want to kind of think of a form answer to have for it to try to move past it, because they're not allowed to ask you that.
Thank you so much, Heather. Beth, do you have any quick closing thoughts before we wrap up?
Just to kind of echo what Mason said about seeing your disability as a positive in the legal environment. I mean, certainly with respect to kind of the different perspectives you can bring and the problem solving that you can bring. But I also have seen, I think, firms be more and more supportive of disability as part of their diversity programs, and corporations who will become law firm clients are focused on it more and more for the people that they hire. I've been asked to be part of so many pitches, and obviously it's, because I, have a lot of experience now in the healthcare group, but I think part of it is to show Sibley's diversity. And so I think, both the firm and clients value that. And so again, I think when I was a student, I was so concerned that people would just see my disability as a negative in the legal profession, and that really hasn't been the case. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Beth. This is Marissa. Thank you, Allie, and thank you, everyone. Thanks, Allie, for being a fantastic moderator. Thank you all for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it. If you have any feedback, positive, negative, neutral, please feel free to email us at info@endulsa.org. Don't forget, if you like this content, follow our socials, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. Sign up to be a member at endulsa.org. I put that info in the chat. Donate if you have funds. I put that info in the chat also. And if you have any further questions, again, feel free to email us at info@endulsa.org. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.
For more, please subscribe and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at facebook or twitter.com/NATDLSA.